Sam Harris, a 73-year-old farmer, faces heartbreak when his family's century-old farm is slated for auction over $14,000 in back taxes he didn't know he owed. With his life savings in an envelope, he arrives at the courthouse only to be humiliated and escorted out for not having a certified check. As laughter echoes behind him, Sam sits defeated on his truck's tailgate, unaware that a security camera captured the injustice. Suddenly, 5 black SUVs screech to a halt. Governor Melissa Grant steps out, her arrival signaling a dramatic turn that could save Sam's legacy. If Sam Harris's story of quiet strength moved you, help us share more tales of resilience. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join us in keeping these powerful lessons alive for future generations. Your support ensures stories like Sam's continue to inspire. Thank you. The auctioneer's sneer cut through the air like a blade as he ripped the registration form from Sam Harris's trembling, work-worn hands. "People like you don't belong here," he spat, his voice thick with contempt. The words echoed in the opulent hall, its chandeliers casting a cold glow over the polished crowd. Laughter rippled through the room, sharp and mocking, each snicker landing like a blow on Sam's weathered heart. At 73, Sam Harris stood frozen, his broad shoulders hunched under the weight of their scorn. His gnarled fingers clutched a tattered envelope, bulging with every dollar he'd saved over a lifetime of labor on his Kansas farm. The money inside was more than currency. It was years of early mornings, blistered hands, and quiet prayers for rain. Humiliation churned in his chest, a bitter mix of anger and shame. But Sam's eyes stayed steady, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of his defeat. Before he could find his voice, 2 security guards appeared, their faces blank as stone. They seized his arms with practiced efficiency, steering him toward the exit. His worn boots scraped against the marble floor, the sound drowned out by the fading laughter of the elite who deemed him unworthy. Unbeknownst to the crowd, a security camera mounted above the entrance had recorded every second. The auctioneer's venom, Sam's silent resolve, the guard's cold dismissal. Minutes after Sam's ejection, the atmosphere outside shifted. 5 black SUVs, their state flags snapping in the wind, roared up to the building's grand steps, kicking up clouds of dust. The doors swung open and Governor Melissa Grant emerged, her expression fierce and unyielding. Her arrival was a storm cloud on the horizon, and the auction, built on arrogance, was about to face a reckoning that would rewrite its course. Sam Harris was no ordinary man. Farming wasn't just his trade, it was his lifeblood, a calling that had shaped him long before he could walk. His family had worked the fields of Lacey County for nearly a century, their story carved into the land itself. His grandfather, Elijah Harris, had staked their claim in 1927, a wiry young man with calloused hands and a heart full of grit. Elijah cleared the fields stone by stone, his palms raw and bleeding, driven by a stubborn dream of roots in a world that offered none. When the Great Depression swept through, turning the plains into a wasteland of dust and despair, Elijah refused to break. While others abandoned their farms, he stayed, planting seeds in barren soil, trusting the land to reward his faith. Sam's father, George, inherited that same fierce spirit. He modernized the farm with tractors and irrigation, but he never forgot the old ways. To George, the land had a voice, a cadence of growth and rest that spoke to those who listened. He taught Sam to hear it, how to read a storm in the air's sharp tang, how to mend a fence with wire and patience, how to nurture life from the unyielding Kansas earth. Sam didn't just farm the land, he was bound to it, body and soul. Every sunrise he rose to meet, every seed he planted, every harvest he gathered was a sacred act, a continuation of a vow passed down through generations. This land is yours to tend, but also yours to guard. The farm was his anchor, his pride, his proof that a man could build something enduring through sweat and faith. In quiet moments, standing in the fields as the wind whispered through the wheat, Sam felt the presence of his ancestors, their strength flowing through him like the roots beneath his feet. He carried their sacrifices in his heart, their resilience a shield against the world's indifference. In the small towns of America, men like Sam Harris were the unseen heroes, their lives woven into the fabric of communities that rarely made the news. They didn't seek applause or headlines, Their victories were humble, their losses borne in silence. A calf surviving a brutal winter night brought a quiet smile to Sam's lips. A harvest that paid the bills filled him with cautious hope. A barn roof that held through a storm was a triumph of persistence. Sam lived by values that felt almost sacred. Loyalty to his land, honesty in his work, perseverance through every setback. These were the cornerstones of the American dream, the belief that hard work and decency would forge a life of purpose, a legacy that outlived its maker. Sam planted seeds for harvests he might never see, mended fences for children yet unborn, poured his heart into the soil without expecting praise. His was a life of steady, unspoken grace. Yet the world had moved on, leaving men like Sam behind. In an era of instant fame and fleeting trends, the quiet dignity of farmers was ignored. Their struggles, a drought that killed crops, a bank's cold foreclosure notice, unfolded in the shadows, unnoticed by a society chasing the next big thing. Their victories went uncelebrated, their grief unshared. The irony twisted in Sam's gut as he stood outside the auction hall, the crowd's laughter still ringing in his ears. The people who fed the nation, who worked the land that sustained it, were dismissed as relics, their lives deemed irrelevant in the march of progress. But Sam held fast to the truths his father and grandfather had taught him. Stand tall, keep going, the land endures. And as the governor's SUVs idled at the steps, Sam's story was poised to prove that endurance could outshine even the loudest scorn. Sam Harris woke each morning with the weight of the world pressing against his chest, a burden not of despair but of duty. The land he worked wasn't just dirt and crops, it was a living promise, woven into his bones by generations of Harrises who had toiled before him. Self-reliance wasn't a choice for Sam, it was the air he breathed. Perseverance wasn't a virtue he bragged about, it was the rhythm of his days, as steady as the sunrise over the cornfields. Humility kept his head bowed, not in shame but in reverence for the soil that had sustained him. Yet, in a world that claimed to honor such values, Sam felt increasingly like a stranger, pushed to the edge by forces he couldn't see or touch. In sleek boardrooms miles away, men in suits decided the fate of land, food, and futures without ever setting foot in a field. They didn't know Sam, didn't care about the calluses on his hands or the hope he planted with every seed. Prices fell, markets shifted, laws changed. And still Sam rose each dawn, driven by a quiet faith that the land would endure, even if he might not. Sam wasn't one for grand gestures or fiery speeches. He didn't see himself as a hero or a martyr, just a man doing what was right. His connection to the farm wasn't some romantic notion. It was sacred, a vow etched into his soul. He was a steward, a link in a chain stretching back to ancestors he'd never met, reaching forward to a future he might never witness. Every furrow he plowed, every harvest he gathered was a fulfillment of that unspoken promise. Hold fast, stand firm, never let the land slip away without a fight. On a still, heavy morning, Sam dressed with care, pulling on his best blue shirt, the one he saved for church or funerals. His hands, rough as weathered oak, trembled slightly as he tucked an envelope containing his life savings into the pocket of his worn jacket. Climbing into his old pickup truck, its paint faded to a dull gray, he drove into town carrying not just a desperate hope to save his farm, but the weight of every Harris who had ever whispered that vow in the fields. For as long as he could remember, Sam had lived by a simple code. Work hard, keep your promises, pay what you owe, and the world would let you be. It was a belief rooted in the earth, as deep as the wheat he'd grown since he was a boy trailing behind his father's plow. He paid his bills the old-fashioned way, writing checks by hand and delivering them in person whenever he could. Technology baffled him. Online banking felt like trusting a stranger with your wallet, and smartphones seemed like gadgets for folks with too much time on their hands. Every receipt, every scrap of paper tied to the farm was folded neatly and stored in a dented metal filing cabinet in the farmhouse. It was his way of keeping order, of proving to himself and the world that he was a man who met his obligations. So when an official-looking letter arrived from the county office, Sam set it aside at first, assuming it was routine, maybe a tax reminder or a zoning update. It wasn't until that evening, sitting at the kitchen table under the glow of a single bulb, that he finally opened it. His glasses slipped low on his nose as he scanned the page, and his breath caught when he saw the words stamped in bold black ink. Notice of public auction. His farm, the Miller farm, his family's legacy, was listed among properties slated for sale due to unpaid taxes. Sam's heart pounded like a hammer in his chest. He read the letter again, then again, searching for a mistake, a typo, anything to explain the impossible. But the truth stood cold and unyielding. The county claimed he owed nearly $14,000 in back taxes, a debt he'd never known existed. Sleep didn't come that night. Sam sat in the dark, the letter crumpled in his fist, his mind churning with disbelief and fear. How could this happen? He'd paid his taxes every year, just as his father had, just as his grandfather had. The farm wasn't just his home, it was his purpose, the only thing that had kept him standing after his wife Clara passed away the year before. Her absence still ached like a bruise, and now the land, the last piece of her he could hold on to, was slipping through his fingers. By morning, resolve replaced despair. Sam drove into town, the letter gripped tightly in his hand, his jaw set with the stubborn determination that had carried him through decades of drought, frost, and heartbreak. At the county office, a young woman behind the counter greeted him with a smile that faded when she saw the letter. She couldn't have been older than his youngest granddaughter, and her sympathy felt genuine, but her words cut deep. After Clara's death, the property had been reassessed, and small errors in paperwork, missed notices, unfiled forms, had snowballed into penalties and interest. The process was too far gone to halt, unless Sam paid the full amount immediately. Sam stood there, his hat twisted in his hands, nodding as if he understood. But inside, his mind reeled. He was a man of handshakes and honest dealings, not faceless systems and automated letters. He'd always believed that if you looked a man in the eye, you could work things out. Now he faced a world that moved without mercy, a machine that didn't care about the sweat he'd poured into his fields or the promises he'd kept. Leaving the office, Sam felt unmoored, like a boat cut loose in a storm. The rules he'd lived by his whole life had shifted, and he hadn't noticed until the ground gave way beneath him. He climbed back into his truck, the envelope of savings heavy in his pocket, and stared out at the town he'd known all his life. It looked different now, unfamiliar, as if he'd wandered into someone else's story. But Sam Harris wasn't a man who gave up. He'd fight for the land, not because he wanted to win, but because he had no choice. It was who he was, a steward, a keeper of promises, a man who held fast no matter the cost. For Sam Harris, true stability wasn't measured by a hefty bank account or a diversified investment portfolio. It was rooted in the earth itself, the rich, loamy soil that promised another dawn breaking over the same rolling fields, another cycle of sowing seeds and reaping harvests. Stability meant the steady heartbeat of nature, the quiet pride of labor that left his hands calloused and his heart full. It was the certainty that the land his family had nurtured for generations would remain theirs, a legacy of sweat and sacrifice. But now, with a single impersonal sheet of paper, a cold official notice, everything he held dear was slipping through his fingers like dry dust. The weight of that document pressed against his chest, threatening to unravel a lifetime of work and dreams. In his youth, Sam would have faced such a crisis with defiance, rolling up his sleeves and tackling it with the same grit that had carried him through lean years and long days. Back then, his body was a machine, tireless and strong, his mind sharp and unburdened. A challenge was just another task to outwork, another fence to mend, but time had carved its mark on him. Now, at nearly 70, his hands ached after hours in the fields, the joints swollen and stiff. His knees groaned under the chill of early mornings, protesting each step across the uneven ground. His movements were deliberate, his thoughts slower to settle, like sediment drifting to the bottom of a still pond. The prospect of battling a faceless legal system, navigating endless forms, deciphering fine print, and scraping together funds for a lawyer felt like a mountain too steep to climb. Physical labor, no matter how grueling, had always been within his grasp. This bureaucratic maze was a different beast, one that left him feeling small and out of place. There was a quiet cruelty in aging that no one had warned him about. a fragility that crept in uninvited. The institutions he'd once trusted, the bank, the county office, the systems that had seemed fair and straightforward, now felt distant and unyielding. What had once been simple transactions now morphed into labyrinths of jargon and red tape. A single oversight, a misplaced letter, a missed deadline, a misunderstood clause, could spiral into a catastrophe. These tiny missteps, so easy to make, could widen into gaping voids, swallowing decades of toil in an instant. The thought gnawed at Sam, a low hum of dread that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling while the world slept. Yet despite the fear, Sam refused to break. He couldn't accept that a clerical error or a bureaucratic blunder could erase the legacy his family had built through floods, droughts, and wars. Deep within him burned a quiet, stubborn resolve, the kind that had seen his ancestors through hard times. He would fight for his land, not with flashy gestures or loud protests, but with the same dogged determination that had defined his life. He didn't turn to lawyers or rally a crowd online. Instead, he leaned on the only approach he'd ever known. Show up, do what's right, and trust that integrity would carry the day. He had no way of knowing that the world he believed in, a world where hard work and honesty still mattered, might dismiss him as insignificant. Nor could he foresee that, in rare moments, the unyielding dignity of one man could ripple outward, challenging the very system that sought to silence him. Sam woke long before the first hint of dawn, when the sky was still a deep, starless black. It was a reflex etched into his bones after a lifetime of rising early to tend crops and care for livestock. But today, his mission wasn't the familiar routine of farm work. Today, he was about preserving something deeper. The right to hold on to the land that carried his family's story, soaked in their blood, sweat, and prayers. In the soft, flickering light of his bathroom, Sam shaved with care, the razor gliding slowly across his weathered face. His hands, though less steady now, moved with purpose, mindful of each stroke. The ritual grounded him, a small act of control in a morning heavy with uncertainty. He combed his thinning gray hair back neatly, smoothing it with a palm that bore the scars of decades in the fields. From his closet, he chose his Sunday shirt, a pale blue button-up reserved for church or somber occasions like funerals. He pressed the creases flat with his hands, smoothing the fabric as if to bolster his resolve. It was a modest gesture, but it mattered. Sam knew appearances shouldn't define a man's worth, but today he needed to project strength in seriousness, to be seen as a man who deserved to be heard. Under the mattress, where he'd always stashed his most cherished possessions, letters from his late wife, a photo of his children as babies, Sam retrieved an old, yellowed postal envelope. Inside was every dollar he'd managed to save, painstakingly counted and sorted by denomination. He spread the bills across his kitchen table, counting them once more under the dim glow of a single bulb. $14,370. It was enough to settle the debt, enough to save his land, or so he hoped. The numbers blurred as he stared at them, his heart pounding with a mix of fear, and determination. He tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of his worn jacket, pressing his hand against it one last time, as if to anchor himself. With a deep breath, he stepped out into the pre-dawn chill and climbed into his faded '92 Ford pickup, the engine sputtering to life with a familiar rumble. As he drove toward an uncertain future, Sam carried the weight of his family's smears in the fragile hope that his quiet stand might still make a difference. Sam Harris maneuvered his old pickup truck along the winding road into town, the engine grumbling softly under the weight of years. The world outside his dusty windshield transformed gradually, as if the earth itself were reluctant to let go of its rural heart. The open fields, with their patchwork of green and gold, gave way to the stark geometry of asphalt and the reflective sheen of glass buildings. The rising sun cast a warm glow over rows of polished SUVs parked neatly in the courthouse lot, their surfaces gleaming like trophies of a world Sam barely recognized. He felt a pang of alienation, a quiet ache in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. This was not his world, but he had come here with purpose, clutching an envelope that held the sum of his life's labor. Men in tailored suits, their shoes polished to a mirror-like finish, congregated outside the courthouse. They sipped coffee from sleek, overpriced cups, their voices a low hum of self-assured confidence. To them, Sam was invisible, a weathered figure in a battered truck, easing into a parking spot at the lot's farthest edge. If their eyes happened to graze over him, they saw only the worn leather of his boots, the frayed edges of his jacket, a man who seemed to belong to a bygone era, irrelevant to their polished present. Sam felt their indifference like a cold wind, but he squared his shoulders, his calloused hands steady on the wheel. He had faced worse than sidelong glances in his 60 years. He would not be diminished by them. Inside the courthouse, the grand hall buzzed with anticipation. The air was thick with the murmurs of developers and speculators, their conversations sharp and urgent, like predators circling a prize. Sam moved quietly to the back of the room, his steps deliberate, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had come to do. He filled out the auction registration form with painstaking care, his pen moving slowly across the paper, each stroke a testament to the gravity of the moment. His weathered hands, etched with the lines of hard labor, trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the quiet resolve that had carried him through decades of toil. He was here to bid on a piece of land, a small parcel that bordered his own fields, a dream he had nurtured for years. The envelope in his jacket held every dollar he had scraped together, a sum that represented sacrifice, sweat, and unyielding hope. At the registration desk, the young clerk's smile wavered as she took in Sam's appearance. Her eyes flickered over his faded jacket, his work-worn hands, and the faint dust that clung to his boots. She leaned toward her colleague, her whisper sharp and quick, a sound that cut through Sam's quiet confidence like a blade. He felt a flush of heat in his cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and defiance, but he kept his expression steady. Moments later, a man in an immaculate suit approached, his gold watch catching the light as he extended a manicured hand toward Sam's form. "Mr. Harris," the auctioneer said, his voice dripping with condescension, his frown deepening as he scanned the page. "You're planning to pay in Pahya?" Sam nodded, his jaw tight, and reached into his jacket for the envelope. "I have the full amount," he said, his voice low but steady, each word chosen with care. The money was real, hard-earned, counted and recounted in the quiet of his kitchen table late at night. But the auctioneer didn't even glance at the thick stack of bills Sam held out. Instead, his voice rose, sharp and cutting, slicing through the hum of the room. "We require a certified check or bank guarantee. This isn't a flea market." The words landed like a slap, and laughter rippled through the crowd, a cruel chorus that made Sam's stomach twist. He felt the weight of their judgment, the way their eyes dismissed him as something less than human, a relic out of place in their world of polished surfaces and bureaucratic rules. Sam stiffened, his heart pounding, but he refused to let his dignity falter. He tried to explain, his voice calm yet firm, that the auction notice had made no mention of such requirements. He had read it carefully, over and over, to be sure, but the auctioneer waved him off with a flick of his hand, as if Sam were a bothersome insect. "Security will escort you out," he announced, turning his back without a second glance. Two guards appeared, their expressions polite but unyielding, their hands gently but firmly taking Sam by the elbows. The touch was not rough, but it carried the weight of finality, leaving no room for protest. As they guided him toward the grand doors, Sam caught fragments of the crowd's amusement, mocking whispers, stifled chuckles, the kind of casual cruelty reserved for those deemed unworthy of notice. Each sound stung, but Sam refused to let it break him. He held his head high, the envelope still clutched tightly against his chest, a lifeline to his purpose. Stepping back into the harsh morning sun, Sam felt the world shift beneath him. The courthouse loomed behind him, its stone columns and gleaming windows a monument to a system that valued appearances over substance. He sat heavily on the tailgate of his truck, the metal cold against his thighs, and stared at the envelope in his hands. His fingers, so sure when guiding at a plow or mending a fence, trembled now. Not from anger, nor even from shame, but from the crushing realization that in this world beyond his fields, a man's worth was measured by the cut of his clothes, the shine of his shoes, the paperwork he carried. Sam's life had been built on honesty, on the quiet strength of hard work, on the principles he lived by every day in the rough acres of his farm. Yet here, in the shadow of the courthouse, Those values seemed to mean nothing. He gazed at the building, a stoic figure against the backdrop of stone and glass, his heart heavy with the weight of rejection. Sam had more integrity in the calluses of his hands than many of those men had in their entire beings. But it didn't matter. His boots were dusty, his jacket threadbare, his money wrapped in the wrong kind of paper. To them, he was nobody, a fleeting inconvenience to be brushed aside. America, Sam thought, often spoke of honoring hard work, perseverance, and decency, but those words rang hollow today. They were values praised only when dressed in the right suit, backed by the right connections, or certified by the right documents. Sam lived those values in every furrow he plowed, in every season he endured, in every choice he made to keep going despite the odds. Yet today, because he didn't fit their polished image of success, he was dismissed, his dreams reduced to a formality he hadn't been told to follow. As he sat there, the envelope still safe in his jacket, Sam felt the weight of a world that judged not by character but by appearances, not by endurance but by procedure. He was a man out of place, a farmer in a realm of suits and signatures, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would climb back into his truck and drive home to the fields that knew his worth. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the lot, and Sam remained, a quiet figure of resilience, holding fast to the principles that defined him, even as the world around him turned away. Sam Harris perched on the tailgate of his rusted pickup truck, the weight of the world pressing down on him, heavier than the relentless midday sun. His calloused hands, etched with years of toil, clutched a worn envelope, its edges frayed from being turned over and over in his grip. Inside that envelope was a final notice, a cold official document that threatened to unravel everything he'd poured his life into, his family's farm, a patchwork of fields and memories that stretched back generations. He could still feel the dirt under his fingernails from the last time he'd walked those rows, planting seeds with a hope that now felt like a distant dream. The thought of losing it all gnawed at his chest, a quiet panic that made every breath feel borrowed. Inside the courthouse, the auction was in full swing, a mechanical process that didn't care about the sweat and love Sam had invested in his land. To the bidders and clerks, his farm was just a line item, a parcel to be sold to the highest bidder. Someone who'd never felt the earth crumble between their fingers or watched the sunrise spill gold across the crops. Sam had been escorted out earlier, his protest drowned out by the hum of bureaucratic efficiency. Now he sat outside, a man reduced to a spectator in his own tragedy, the weight of inevitability settling into his bones. He didn't know that fate, in the form of a woman in a navy blue suit, was already speeding toward him, ready to upend everything. A faint hum broke through his thoughts, distant at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Sam squinted into the blinding sunlight, his heart stirring with a mix of curiosity and dread. The sound became a roar, sirens, engines, the unmistakable pulse of authority. 5 sleek black SUVs tore into the courthouse parking lot, their tinted windows gleaming like obsidian. Flanking them were 2 police motorcycles, their lights flashing red and blue. Each vehicle bore a small, proud emblem, the state flag. The convoy screeched to a halt, kicking up dust that swirled in the heavy air. Doors swung open in perfect unison, and security agents spilled out, their movements sharp and practiced, eyes scanning the lot like hawks. From the center SUV emerged a figure who commanded the scene without a word. A woman, her navy suit crisp and tailored, moving with the unyielding confidence of someone who didn't waste time on pleasantries. Governor Melissa Grant was a force, a storm wrapped in professionalism, her presence radiating power that silenced the chaos around her. The crowd of investors, clerks, and onlookers froze mid-sentence, their small talk evaporating into a stunned hush. Just moments ago, some of them had smirked as Sam was ushered out, their laughter sharp and careless. Now they scrambled to clear a path for the governor, their bravado replaced by deference. Local news cameras swiveled, reporters shouting questions that went unanswered. Governor Grant's focus was a blade, cutting through the noise as she strode toward the courthouse doors, her heels clicking with purpose on the pavement. Sam watched, his heart thudding, unsure whether this spectacle meant salvation or something else entirely. Government, Sam had always thought, was a machine, cold, plodding, and indifferent. It was endless forms, tangled red tape, and decisions made in rooms he'd never see. People like him got lost in its gears, their stories buried under layers of procedure. He'd seen it happen before, neighbors foreclosed on, dreams swallowed by paperwork. But sometimes, he was learning, change didn't come from the system itself, but from someone inside it. Someone who saw the rules as tools to serve people, not chains to bind them. Governor Grant was that kind of leader. She'd read Sam's letter, a desperate plea he'd scrawled late at night, his words raw with the fear of losing everything. Something in those lines had pierced through the political noise, demanding her attention, compelling her to act. Inside the courthouse, the auctioneer's gavel hovered mid-strike, his voice faltering as Governor Grant's commanding presence filled the room. "This proceeding is temporarily suspended," she declared, her voice ringing with authority that left no room for argument. The bidders exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. The auctioneer, his face pale and his confidence shaken, gestured vaguely toward the exit when asked about Sam Harris. "Find him," Governor Grant instructed her aides, her tone sharp but steady, a leader who knew the weight of her words. Sam was still outside, his cap clutching in his hands, when they came for him. As he was led back into the courthouse, his boots scuffing against the polished floor, he felt a strange mix of hope and fear churning in his gut. He wasn't used to being noticed, let alone summoned by someone like her. Standing before Governor Melissa Grant, Sam felt small, exposed under her steady, piercing gaze. She extended her hand, her expression firm, but not unkind. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that caught him off guard, "I received your letter." Sam fumbled as he shook her hand, his rough fingers trembling slightly. "I didn't expect, I never thought anyone would read it," he stammered, his voice thick with the weight of disbelief. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, softening the edges of her authority. "I read every letter that crosses my desk," she said, and whether that was entirely true didn't matter. For Sam, in this moment, it was real. It was enough. She turned to her staff, her demeanor shifting back to business. "Issue an administrative hold on the Miller property transaction under Regulation 42B for improper notification of sale terms," she ordered, her words precise, cutting through the bureaucratic fog. Sam blinked, struggling to parse the jargon. He wasn't versed in the language of regulations, but he understood the crux. The sale was halted, at least for now. Relief flooded through him, mingling with disbelief like rain on parched soil. He stood there, cap in hand, as the weight of the envelope in his pocket seemed to lighten, if only a little. Governor Grant's intervention wasn't just a delay, it was a lifeline, a chance to fight another day. And in that moment, Sam felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Sam Harris stood in the dusty yard of his family farm, the weight of an envelope clutched tightly against his chest, its edges worn from his anxious grip. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields he'd toiled over for decades, fields that had fed his family and held his dreams. His heart pounded, not with anger, but with a quiet, stubborn resolve that had carried him through years of drought, debt, and now this, the threat of losing it all to a bureaucratic misstep. Sam wasn't a man who sought the spotlight. He wasn't one for speeches or grand gestures. He was a farmer, rooted in the soil as deeply as the crops he tended, and all he wanted was fairness. That belief, unshakable as the oak tree by the barn, had driven him to the county auction with his life savings stuffed into that envelope, a final stand to keep what was his. Inside, his mind churned. He thought of his late wife, Ellen, who used to hum softly while canning peaches in the kitchen, her laughter filling the house like sunlight. He thought of his son, now grown and gone to the city, who'd once run through these fields with a kite trailing behind him. The farm wasn't just land, it was the repository of their shared history, every furrow a testament to their love and labor. Losing it would be like losing them all over again. Yet, as he stood before the crowd at the auction, his weathered hands trembling slightly, a flicker of something new stirred within him. Not victory, too much uncertainty lingered for that, but a fragile, unfamiliar hope. For the first time in days, he felt he wasn't standing alone. Governor Amelia Grant, miles away in the state capitol, sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of reports and the incessant buzz of her phone. She was no stranger to the grind of governance. Budgets to balance, laws to sign, constituents to appease. But beneath the polished exterior of her office, Amelia carried a weight of her own. She'd grown up in a small town not unlike Sam's, where her father, a mechanic, had worked late into the night to keep their family afloat. She remembered the fear in his eyes when bills piled up, the quiet pride when he paid them off. That memory lingered, a compass guiding her through the maze of politics. When Sam's story reached her, through a local reporter's column of all things, she didn't see just a case file. She saw a man, a life, a legacy at stake. Amelia knew the optics of intervening would be scrutinized. Her advisors warned her of the political fallout, the accusations of pandering. But as she read about Sam's quiet stand, something shifted. She felt a pang of recognition, a reminder of why she'd entered public service in the first place. Government wasn't just about efficiency or procedure. It was about people, their struggles, their dignity. She thought of historical moments when one person's courage had rippled outward. Rosa Parks sitting steadfast on a Montgomery bus, her refusal a quiet thunder that shook a nation. A lone man facing a tank in Tiananmen Square, his silhouette a defiant cry for freedom. Sam's act was smaller, humbler, but no less profound. With a steady hand, she signed the order to suspend the auction, not for votes or headlines, but because it was right. 3 days later, Sam's kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The old landline, its cord tangled from years of use, rang unexpectedly, shattering the stillness. Sam hesitated, his calloused fingers hovering over the receiver. Strange calls usually meant trouble, another bill collector, another form to sign. But something, perhaps that same flicker of hope, urged him to answer. A woman's voice, calm and professional, came through, identifying herself as an aide from the governor's office. She asked him to come to the county administration building. "There are matters to discuss," she said, her tone giving nothing away. Sam's stomach sank. Had they found some loophole? Was the fight not over? He hung up, his heart heavy with doubt. Hope, it seemed, was a fragile thing, easily crushed by the weight of bureaucracy. He dressed carefully, pulling on his blue Sunday shirt. The one Ellen had always said brought out the warmth in his eyes. The drive to town felt endless, each mile marker a reminder of the uncertainty waiting for him. His old pickup rattled along the familiar roads, past fields that mirrored his own, past neighbors who'd offered quiet nods of support but little else. Sam's mind raced with what-ifs. What if the suspension was temporary? What if the auction resumed? He gripped the steering wheel tighter, willing himself to stay steady. At the county building, the air was different. The staff, who'd once barely glanced at him, now greeted him by name. Their smiles weren't the curt, obligatory ones he'd grown used to, but warm, almost apologetic. A young clerk led him to a modest conference room where a small group of officials waited. The county administrator, a man with tired eyes and a crisp suit, gestured to a chair. Someone offered coffee, and Sam, feeling like a stranger in this formal setting, nodded stiffly. The administrator cleared his throat and slid a thick folder across the table. In measured, respectful tones, he explained that the tax errors triggering the auction had been deemed invalid. Sam's farm, his home, his legacy, was his again, free and clear. Relief washed over Sam like a cool breeze after a long, hot day. He exhaled, the months of sleepless nights and gnawing worry lifting from his shoulders. But before he could fully process the news, the administrator spoke again. "There's something else, Mr. Harris." A second envelope, this one sealed in crisp ivory paper, was placed before him. The woman from the governor's office, her eyes kind, smiled. "An individual has come forward," she said, "to cover any remaining financial obligations tied to your property and more." Sam's spine stiffened. Charity? He'd never taken a handout in his life. Pride, hard-earned and fiercely guarded, surged within him. "I don't take charity," he said, his voice low but firm. The woman's expression didn't waver. "It's not charity, Mr. Harris," she replied gently. "They consider it repayment." Inside the envelope was a letter, its words written in neat, deliberate script. "Dear Mr. Harris," it began, "when I was 10 years old, my family nearly lost everything. We had no money for seeds, no food to spare. Your father gave us a bushel of corn from your farm, no questions asked. That act of kindness kept us going. I've never forgotten it. Now I'm in a position to give back." The letter went on, detailing a fund to clear Sam's debts and provide for future seasons. Tears pricked Sam's eyes, not just for the relief, but for the realization that his family's legacy of quiet generosity had come full circle. He thought of his father, a man of few words but boundless heart, and felt a swell of pride. The farm wasn't just saved, it was a bridge connecting past kindness to future hope. In the lean years, when the world seemed to press down with a weight that could crush even the sturdiest of spirits, you, Sam Harris, extended a quiet kindness that became a lifeline. I was just a boy then, my father bent under the burden of hard times, his hands calloused from trying to coax life from unyielding soil. You didn't know us well, just neighbors on the fringes of your fields, but you saw our struggle. With no fanfare, you handed my father a worn paper bag, heavy with seeds from your own shed. You stood with him in the dusty yard, your voice steady as you explained how to plant them, how to tease sustenance from the stubborn earth. Those seeds grew into a garden that carried us through the darkest year of our lives, when hunger loomed like a shadow and hope felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. I never forgot your face, weathered like the land you worked, or the way your kindness felt like a rope thrown to a drowning man. Now, standing in a place of stability I never dreamed possible, I'm able to offer a small measure of gratitude for the salvation you didn't even know you provided. A boy who once chased fireflies through your fields is now a man who carries your lesson in his heart. Kindness, given freely, can save a family. Sam read the letter twice, each word sinking into him like rain into parched ground. His hands trembled as he set it down on the scarred kitchen table, his mind reaching back through the haze of decades. So many faces had passed through his life, so many seasons of planting and reaping, that the boy's name, scribbled at the bottom of the page, stirred only a faint echo. He couldn't pin down the memory, couldn't recall the moment he had handed over that bag of seeds. It hadn't felt like charity then, just the right thing to do, the kind of instinct that grows in those who live close to the earth. Yet here it was, all these years later, rippling back to him like a seed long buried, now breaking through the hard crust of time. Sam leaned back in his chair, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of his farmhouse ceiling, and felt a quiet awe. The smallest acts, the ones you scarcely think about, could send out tendrils that stretch far beyond your sight, blooming into something vital, something that might one day return to you when you least expect it. For Sam, that return came in a way he never could have imagined. His farm, the only home he'd ever known, had been slipping through his fingers, caught in the jaws of a system that seemed to chew up men like him without a second thought. The auction scandal had left him reeling, his life's work reduced to a gavel's fall. But then came the grainy security camera footage, capturing the moment he was escorted from the courthouse. His shoulders squared despite the weight of defeat. That image, raw and unpolished, exploded across the internet, shared and reshared until it became a symbol of something bigger. Local news stations aired it first, their anchors speaking of Sam with a reverence usually reserved for heroes. By nightfall, national networks had seized the story, and for a fleeting moment, a fractured nation found common ground. Conservatives saw in Sam a man who stood tall on his own 2 feet, guarding his family's legacy with quiet grit. Progressives saw a fighter, unbowed against a system that too often silenced the powerless. Sam Harris, a farmer from nowhere, became a bridge across a chasm that had seemed unspannable. Headlines bloomed like wildflowers. The farmer who stood alone and won. But talk shows dissected the scandal, their hosts debating what Sam's story meant for a country wrestling with its soul. Calls for reform echoed from commentators, but Sam remained untouched by the clamor. Fame felt like a poorly fitting coat, heavy and awkward. He'd never sought the spotlight. It unsettled him, like a storm cloud hovering over his fields. When the invitation arrived to speak at the state agricultural fair, Sam's first instinct was to decline. He wasn't a man of words, not polished or practiced. His life was measured in soil and seasons, not microphones and applause. But Governor Melissa Grant called him herself, her voice warm but firm, urging him to share his story, not for fame but to spark change. Sam felt the weight of her words, the responsibility they carried, and though his heart raced at the thought, he agreed. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Sam stood behind a podium at the fair, a sea of faces stretching out before him. His knees trembled, and his hands gripped the wooden stand as if it could anchor him. He wore his best shirt, ironed crisp by his daughter that morning, and tucked inside his jacket pocket was the empty envelope that had once held his life savings, a quiet reminder of how close he'd come to losing everything. The crowd hushed as he began, his voice rough with nerves but steady with truth. "I'm not a politician," he said, the words carrying the weight of a man who'd never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "I'm just a farmer. I didn't come here to start a movement or make a point. I came to save the only home I've ever known." He paused, and behind him the large video screens flickered to life, showing the now iconic footage of him being led from the courthouse, head bowed but spirit unbroken. The image hung in the air, a silent testament to resilience. Sam's throat tightened as he continued, his voice growing stronger. "What I learned," he said, "is that sometimes the smallest things, a bag of seeds, a hand offered when no one else is looking, can change a life, maybe even save it." The crowd was silent, hanging on his words, and Sam felt the weight of their gaze, not as judgment, but as connection. He spoke of the land, of the lessons it taught him about patience and hope, about how dignity and compassion, though often unseen, are never wasted. They wait, like seeds in winter, for their season to bloom. For Sam, that season had come, not just in the saving of his farm, but in the proof that his life's quiet decency had mattered. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sam only nodded, stepping back from the podium with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through every harvest, every hardship. He was still just a farmer, but now he understood the seeds he'd planted, both in the earth and in the lives he'd touched, would keep growing long after he was gone. The quiet strength of Sam Harris. Sam Harris never wanted to be a hero. His world was the rolling fields of his family farm, where the sun rose faithfully each morning and the earth held the stories of generations. Yet, in his steadfast fight to save his land, he became a symbol of something far greater, a quiet, unshakable strength that spoke louder than any shout. On the day he stepped onto the town square's weathered stage, Sam's heart thundered with a mix of fear and resolve. His boots, still dusted with the soil of his fields, creaked against the wooden planks. Before him stretched a sea of faces, neighbors he'd known all his life, strangers drawn by whispers of his story, reporters with their relentless cameras. Sam wasn't a man of speeches. His hands, rough from years of labor, gripped the podium as if it could anchor him. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of a life rooted in the land. He told them about his farm, not just the acres of soil, but the memories woven into it. The barn where his grandfather's laughter still seemed to linger. The garden where his mother's hands had once worked with fierce love. He spoke of the threat that had nearly stolen it all, a predatory auction, sparked by a bureaucratic mistake no one seemed eager to correct. His words weren't polished, but they were honest, cutting through the crowd's murmur like a blade. He didn't shout or beg. He simply stood his ground, saying that sometimes doing what's right means staying steady, even when the world doesn't seem to care. By the time he finished, tears glistened in the eyes of those closest to the stage. Strangers wiped their cheeks, and even the sharp-eyed reporters paused, their pens still. As Sam stepped back, his chest tight with the weight of the moment, Governor Grant returned to the stage. The governor's usual polish seemed softened, his voice carrying a rare humility as he announced the Family Farm Preservation Act, a law born from Sam's quiet battle, designed to protect family farms from greed and error. The crowd roared with approval, but Sam, standing in the shadows, felt only a deep, quiet relief. This wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about every family who'd poured their lives into the earth, only to face a system that valued money over meaning. His fight, waged in letters, phone calls, and sleepless nights, had reached further than he'd ever dreamed. Sam's story became a reminder that a nation's strength isn't found only in its skyscrapers or headlines. It's rooted in the lives of people like him, humble, unseen, yet vital. One man with a farm had sparked a movement, a story too stubborn to be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, the media's frenzy faded, as it always does. For Sam, life slipped back into its familiar rhythm. He rose with the dawn, the sky painted in soft pinks and golds. He walked his fields, the earth beneath his feet feeling alive, sacred. His hands found comfort in the old tasks, planting, repairing, tending. The farm, once nearly lost, pulsed with new life, as if it knew the battle it had survived. But Sam's story didn't vanish. It took root in quiet ways. School children came, their voices bright with questions as they touched the farm's ancient trees and learned its history. Their curiosity warmed Sam's heart, reminding him of his own boyhood. Neighbors, too, began to linger. People who'd once passed with a quick nod now stopped to share a story, lend a hand, or sit on the porch and talk about the weather. These small gestures wrapped around Sam like a quilt, steadying him against the weight of his unexpected fame. He'd never sought recognition, but the community's quiet kindness told him he was seen, valued, loved. Sam remained himself through it all, steady, humble, rooted in a tradition older than memory. His story wasn't about grand speeches or fleeting fame. It was about the strength that doesn't demand attention, the kind that endures when no one's watching. In a world that often prized noise over substance, Sam Harris stood as a quiet reminder that hard work, dignity, and community still mattered. His story spoke to something deeper too. In a time when systems loomed large and cold, when ordinary voices could feel lost in the clamor of modern life, Sam's resolve showed that one person's stand could still echo. It could ripple across towns, across hearts, across a nation. His quiet courage reminded people that the truest strength lies not in the loudest voices, but in the hands that build, the lives that nurture, the souls that endure.